Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're unpacking a really fascinating, deeply profound subject based on a specific theological text called The Sovereign Voice, Christ's Authority Over Death and Rapture. We're going to be looking closely at the framework this text lays out regarding, ultimate authority. We're talking about a power so absolute that it governs both life and death, and how it all culminates in that future prophetic event widely known as the rapture. The text maps out the scriptural evidence of his immense power, and we'll be examining the dramatic contrast it draws between global chaos on earth and eternal hope in heaven.
Okay, let's dive into this. To really understand the future, the source material anchors us firmly in the past, pointing directly to historical, scriptural evidence of his power. We start off in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verse 43. Jesus is standing right before a tomb, and he speaks just three simple words: "Lazarus, come forth." Now, this isn't just a story about a healing, right? It's presented as a total demonstration of absolute sovereign jurisdiction over mortality itself. And the text makes a very specific point here. Jesus didn't perform some complex ritual. He simply used his voice.
Section 1. Authority over the grave. The source material draws a direct, basically unbreakable line here between the power of creation and the power of resurrection. It argues that the exact same authority used to create the heavens, literally the power that stretched out the infinite universe, is the exact same authority that commands the grave. I mean, it's a staggering scale of power when you really think about it, equating the birth of galaxies to waking up a dead man. The text emphasizes that death absolutely could not resist. It wasn't a struggle, it wasn't a negotiation. The grave literally had to obey the spoken word of the Messiah. Lazarus rose for one reason and one reason only: because the Messiah spoke. The physical reality of death was entirely subordinate to that sovereign voice, which really establishes the foundational premise of this entire text. That voice, it carries unparalleled, irresistible authority.
Section 2. The Prophetic Promise.
So let's look at how this builds from a localized historical miracle at a single tomb in Bethany to a massive global scale. The fundamental argument here is that the event with Lazarus was a precedent. One day, that exact same sovereign voice, the voice the grave couldn't resist, is going to speak once again. But this time, it won't just be directed at one man. And this brilliantly illustrates that incredible expansion of power. Just look at this quote from John chapter 5, verses 28 and 29. "All that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth." The scriptural evidence of his power scales up dramatically here, moving from one man, Lazarus, to all that are in the graves. The text states that those who died in Christ, those who live faithfully trusting in him, are waiting for this specific audio cue, the voice of the Creator calling them out of the dust.
The source text then gets super specific about the actual mechanics of how this unfolds, referencing 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 16 and 17. It outlines a really precise two-step sequence for the rapture. Step 1, the dead in Christ rise first. They hear that sovereign voice and are resurrected. Then, step 2, the believers who are still alive and remain on earth are immediately caught up together with them to meet the Lord in the air. For the faithful believer, the text describes this as a glorious, unprecedented promise. It's the ultimate victory over mortality.
Section 3. Global Chaos and Panic.
But here is where the narrative takes a really sharp, drastic turn. We just talked about this glorious promise up in the air, but what happens down on the ground? While heaven is rejoicing and believers are gathered, the earth is plunged into an unprecedented crisis. We're looking at sudden, unexplainable global chaos and panic. The text describes a scenario where, literally, in a fraction of a second, millions of people disappear instantly. Just imagine the immediate logistical and emotional nightmare. Families are desperately searching for missing loved ones. Out on the highways, vehicles suddenly crash because their drivers have just vanished. Up in the sky, airplanes lose their pilots. Out on the oceans, ships are left drifting without captains. It's this rapid-fire chain reaction of global infrastructure collapse causing absolute panic and fear to spread uncontrollably across every single nation.
And in the midst of all this physical chaos, the text highlights a profound psychological and spiritual crisis too. For those who previously ignored the message of salvation, for those who mocked holiness, the sudden disappearance of millions serves as a devastating awakening. The text points out the tragic realization of those left behind. They suddenly understand the absolute truth of the prophetic promise, but they realize it a moment too late. The window for preparation has instantly, permanently closed.
Section 4, a promise of eternal hope.
From that incredibly dark reality on earth, the text pivots us right back up to the heavens. Because while the earth is experiencing humanity's greatest confusion, the narrative for the redeemed is entirely different. For those caught up in the air, the rapture is described not just as an escape, but as a moment of eternal honor. The text emphasizes that Christ himself, the King of Glory who created all things, will come specifically for his bride, gathering his people to himself forever. So the crucial point is this central dichotomy of the entire source text. We have a stark contrast between global chaos and eternal hope. On one side, you have the earthly reality of the rapture, unyielding panic, paralyzing fear, and that tragic, belated realization of the mockers. But on the other side, you have the heavenly reality, eternal hope, profound honor, Christ coming for his bride, and just absolute rejoicing. The text presents these two realities occurring in the exact same fraction of a second, which perfectly highlights the ultimate consequence of how one responds to that sovereign authority.
Which brings us to the application part. Why does this analysis matter right now, today? Well, the source concludes that understanding this massive contrast between the impending chaos and the promised hope should actively shape our daily lives. It shouldn't just be some abstract theological concept we think about occasionally. The text strongly urges every believer to use this hope as a catalyst to live carefully, faithfully, and expectantly, because the overarching message, really the driving heartbeat of the source material, is that Jesus is coming soon.
And that leaves us with a deeply personal question to consider. As you look at the scriptural evidence of his power, and as you weigh that stark contrast between sudden global chaos and the promise of eternal joy, you really have to ask yourself, how does this promise of eternal hope change the way you live today? If that sovereign voice could speak at literally any moment, how does that reality alter your priorities, your faithfulness, and your expectancy right now? It's an incredibly powerful thought to carry with you. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking to understand the profound texts that shape our world.